Thank you for staying with us on Citizen Weekend. And we delve into a conversation. We have journalists, two of them, one from Nigeria, on call, essentially, virtually. We have Seun Akioya, who is in Abuja, Nigeria. He's the social media mobilization manager for Action Aid in Nigeria, but a journalist by training and practice of 20 years standing, including associate editor, investigative and features for The Nation in Nigeria. We also have with us, joining us from Dhaka in Bangladesh, Redwan Ahmed, a journalist. But let's set the stage for this conversation. In the last month, we've witnessed youth-led protests in Kenya, Nigeria and Bangladesh. What do they speak to, and what lessons are there to learn for the governments? Let's set the stage for that discussion with this report.
The similarities are uncanny. The timing even more so. As Kenya embarked on month-long protests against punitive taxes, students in Bangladesh were up in arms over a discriminatory jobs policy that set aside a third of government jobs for the children and grandchildren of liberation fighters. What started out as peaceful protests turned violent when police employed excessive force to quell the protests, as was the case in Kenya. A reversal of the jobs policy by the Bangladesh Supreme Court did not come soon enough. And the cry now was for justice for the young lives needlessly lost. Again, as was the case in Kenya, unarmed protesters were killed by police in civilian clothing and military deployed. With the addition of a curfew in Bangladesh and an internet shutdown, as calls mounted for an end to Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's rule. Things came to a head 6 days ago when a deadly day of protests left 100 dead and Hasina was forced to flee to neighboring India after the military drew a line in the sand and ruled out firing at civilians to enforce a curfew. The police chief and central bank governor were not far behind. The protesters making a statement when they stormed the Prime Minister's palace and helped themselves to the food there, as Kenyan protesters did when they stormed Parliament, declaring by their actions that government opulence is now out of style. The protesters got their way. An interim government led by Nobel Peace Prize winner Muhammad Yunus. The Economist credited with lifting millions out of poverty through providing access to microcredit.
1 second, sir. Yes, sir.
Wait, I can't hear you.
That's good. Coming back home. Thank you.
Nigeria, whose 2020 end SARS protests against police brutality left an indelible mark, were not far behind, and inspired by Kenya, declared 10 days of protests over the state of their economy.
Wake up, Nigerians! Say no to bad government!
As with President William Ruto, Tinubu Bola called for dialogue with the youth over his unpopular economic policies, which include removal of a fuel subsidy.
They said the protest is being sponsored. It is not sponsored by anybody.
There too, police have been accused of killing tens of protesters.
All right, let's start with Redwan, who is in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Are the protests still on? What do things look like now?
Thanks, Fali, for having me. And, so the protests have died down. They are not entirely silent yet, but, the scale is pretty much almost non-existent. But, there's still sporadic protests everywhere happening, especially in the region where there is an Awami stronghold who are currently trying to come out to the come to the road and show support for the fled former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Other than that, the nation is currently, what they are saying is on a nation rebuilding phase. And, that's the latest here.
All right. What about the situation in Nigeria soon? It was 10 days of rage, as I understood it, and the 10 days came to an end today?
Yes, absolutely. The 10 days came to an end today in Nigeria. And despite the fact that the president spoke on the fourth day and asked the protesters to go home and gave a lot of promises, those were promises that have been rehashed over the years. The protesters continued until today. There was a rally today in the major cities in Nigeria, and the protesters are, even though going off the streets today, but they have promised that if their demands are not met by the government, they are going to come back on the street with a 1 million man march this time around. So that presently is the situation in Nigeria.
Okay, let me get back to you, Red One. What triggered this protest was the jobs allocation policy, where a third of jobs went to those who are children and grandchildren of those who fought for liberation in Bangladesh. Why was this such a contentious issue?
So, I mean, if we look at it, the outcome that happened in last week, the ouster of the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, was the last, the nail was this protest, but it actually started way before, since the Prime Minister won, the Sheikh Hasina won her election in 2009. And since then, she was critiqued for being increasingly very authoritarian in her ruling. And she started, quelling dissent of any form, not only the opposition parties, but she started quelling dissent from every part of the country, every citizen. So there was a brewing anger against her regime, and that basically came out through this particular movement that happened on the job quota allocation. So that was the starting point in the last phase, and eventually it became very deadly at some point because the government forces, including the pro-Awami League, the pro-Awami League forces like the student wing and the other forces, they joined forces with police, and they started this crackdown on the protesters, and their lives were lost of unarmed protesters. That really fueled more anger, and at some point the entire movement was not only about the job allocation quota, because eventually the Supreme Court gave a ruling scaling back the job quota for those who fought in the war in the liberation down to 5%. But at that point, that was like too little too late. And at that point, the protesters, they had only one demand, that the resignation of the Prime Minister, because she was being held accountable for all the killings that took place. Nearly 400 lives have been lost until now. So that was the entire, some of the context, if I may, Olive.
All right. And I'm curious, the Prime Minister made several attempts to quell the protests. You talk about the excessive use of force by the police, including by civilian-clad policemen shooting unarmed protesters. And there was video evidence of that captured. But there was also the shutdown of the internet and the deployment of the military. Why, in your opinion, didn't this go the Prime Minister's way?
I think, in my opinion, that actually backfired. The shutting off the internet and in attempt to disorient the protesters so that they cannot use the internet, they cannot use the social media to mobilize. And eventually, she had to deploy the army, which is often seen as the last resort. And people had fear even then when she started deploying the army that it might be leading towards something that actually happened. So it eventually happened. The army did take over. I think it was the people surprising, and they pretty much outnumbered, and lives were being lost every day. The day before she resigned, there were more than 100 people were dead on the street nationwide on these clashes between the protesters and the pro-government forces. So at some point, even the military and the army said, like, we cannot be accomplice to this bloodbath, because when there was news that we got news that hundreds and thousands of people started marching towards the Prime Minister's residence. And at the very last moment, the army said, like, we cannot start opening fire on them, like killing them mercilessly. So at that point, she didn't have any options left other than to resign and to flee for safe exit, which we believe to be she's in India. in an undisclosed location.
All right. Seun, I remember the End SARS protests of 2020, and those were they were against police brutality. But even with these protests, which my understanding are about the economic policies of your president, I've heard that 22 people were killed. Was there a difference in how police managed protesters this time round?
There is. I can't tell you that there is a difference between the way the police managed the protest this time around, even though there were lessons to be learned from the End SARS protest. End SARS was basically against the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, who, abandoned their core mandate and started targeting young people. And it was brutal in 2020. You know how many people were killed. Today in Nigeria, during this protest against hunger and hardship, at least from unofficial sources, 40 young people have been brutally murdered, even though the police will come out to say it's just about 17. But figures range from 17 to 40. And I do not know what lessons the police have learned. The police, Inspector General of Police, actually came out to threaten young people, to say that they are going to deploy all their, forces to make sure that the protest is stopped, because there was a narrative from government that the protest was about taking over government, forcefully removing the government of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu from power, which is a false narrative. So the police came all out. I myself was in some of the protests, and I was tear gassed, and my car was smashed and all of that. And so I was part of those who were brutalized by the police. So there was no difference. The military came out, the DSS came out, and let me tell you that some of our comrades, some of the young people are still in detention. They were raided, their homes were raided as early as 2 a.m. and they were taken to unknown destinations. We are still trying to track some of them now, and this is apart from those who are dead. And the military was also used to quell the protest. To brutalize.
All right, so I do apologize to you and our viewers. Unfortunately, the connection there appears to be spotty.
The military is still, threatening that if things... Oh, okay, sorry, I can hear you very loud and clear. So what I'm saying is that there has been no difference in the treatment by the police from 2020 and this current protest against hunger and hardship. It was high-handed. I myself was part of the protest, and I was brutalized as well, tear gassed by the police, despite the fact that I'm not entirely a young person. The DSS, the Secret Service, arrested some of our young people. We are still trying to track them now. We don't know where they are. They have been arrested. They took them from their homes around 2 a.m. and we don't know where they are now. We are trying to track them. We hope that they are safe. So this is the situation that we have in Nigeria, and we see that the police is still unrelenting. They have come out to say, oh, they did not use brutal force, but what about figures between 17 and 40 young people that were brutally murdered and slaughtered on the streets of their motherland, simply because they were asking for better living standards, simply because they were saying that they are hungry.
All right. Let me come to you now. Red One, what is the situation? I heard there were calls for the Chief Justice to resign, and he has promised to do so?
Yeah, so as the interim government took charge, and the Chief Justice today did tender his resignation, and we have a new Chief Justice, as long as new judges in the appellate division of the High Court, of the same day, which is pretty remarkable. Like, we haven't had similar instances, I don't know, since when. So there have been some, a lot of changes that will be taking place under this new interim government, and they are just starting.
All right, I'd like to thank Redwan Ahmed, a journalist based in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and Seun Akioya, who is in Abuja, Nigeria, journalist by profession and training, and he is the social media mobilization manager for Action Aid Nigeria. We engage foreign affairs, diplomacy, security experts on the other side of this break.